Hi, this is Edward Troxel. Last week we looked at how to go through each event on the timeline and look at the effects that are on that event. And we also looked to see what parameters are available for each one of those effects. Today we're going to expand on that and look further and be able to actually get the values of those parameters. And if there are keyframes, we'll go through each one of the keyframes on that parameter. As each parameter can be keyframed individually, it could be a lot of keyframes along the way. You saw the keyframes in the beginning of the last video, and so let's see how we can read those values now. This is where we left off last week. We went through and looked at every track in the project. If it was a video track, then we looked at every event on that track, converted it to a video event, then we went through each effect on that track, checked to see if it was an OFX effect, got the OFX effect here, and then we looked through every parameter in that OFX effect. We skipped these, the presets, the page, the group, and so forth, and then we got the parameter names, parameter labels, and so forth, and then we displayed that using a message box. This week we're going to extend that by looking at the actual parameters. So now that we know the parameter type and what it is, we're going to have to go through each parameter to look to see, does it have keyframes and what values are they? So we're starting new code here, and we're going to have a switch, and then we're going to convert the OFX parameter type to string. And the first one we're going to look at is an RGB. That's a red, green, blue color parameter. So this, you have to get an OFX RGB parameter. Each different type here has its own type of variable, and we're just going to use parameter 1 for this. Then we are converting to OFX RGB parameter the OFX of the name that we are looking at. So this is the first one. As we go through these, we get each name, and so we're going to specifically look for that particular name. Then we're going to add to our string how many keyframes are there. If there's only one keyframe, then we're going to say there's a single keyframe, and this is the value. In this case, I got to get the value .r, the value .g, and the value .b. Otherwise, we need to go through all of the list of keyframes. So not only do we have a different parameter type for each one of these types, we also have a different keyframe type for each one of these. So this is an OFX RGB keyframe, and we'll go through for each key one in the p1.keyframes. Then we're going to get a keyframe at, and it is located at this time, and then it has this value, which once again we have to look at the RGB, and then we can also get the interpolation that is used for this keyframe. Now we're going to do the exact same thing again, only this time we're going to use the case RGBA. It's basically going to be exactly the same, only this is going to be OFX RGBA parameter. This down here is going to be OFX RGBA keyframe, and when we look at the value, we're going to get .r, .g, .b, and .a. Same thing down here, .r, .b, .g, .a. And then we get the interpolation as well. Next is a double. For the double, we use the OFX double parameter. Once again, we get the count of the keyframes. If the keyframe count is 0, then we have a single keyframe with this value. If it has multiple keyframes, then we use OFX double keyframe. And then for every keyframe, we can get the time, the value, and the interpolation. Next will be a double 2D, and that will be an OFX double 2D parameter with an OFX double 2D keyframe. The big difference here is we're going to use a value .x and a value .y because it is a 2D parameter. Then we get to the double 3D. We're going to use an OFX double 3D parameter, and once again we'll look at the keyframes count, If it's a single value, then this time we're going to get an X, Y, and Z because it's a 3D parameter. If we have more than one keyframe, then we have to look at the OFX double 3D keyframe parameter and go through each of the keyframes. And same thing here, X, Y, and Z. Next we have an integer, which is an OFX integer parameter and an OFX integer keyframe. And we just get the value and the interpolation, and if it has multiple keyframes, we get the time. Continuing on, integer 2D with an OFX integer 2D parameter and an OFX integer 2D keyframe. In this case, once again, we would need to get the p2 dot value dot x and the put a comma in here, the p2 dot value dot y. We would need to change this down here as well to the dot x and dot y. And then here we have the integer 3D using the OFX integer 3D parameter. Once again, we would need to change this to dot x plus p2 dot value dot y, in this case plus p2 dot value dot z. And then of course we would need to do the same thing down here, getting the x, y, and z used from the OFX integer 3D keyframes. Our next one is a choice parameter. This would be a drop-down box where if you have a list of options you can choose from, this will give us the choice parameter. And so once again we can get the value of the choice parameter, and if we have keyframes, it would be OFX choice keyframes, and we can get the time, the value, and the interpolation there as well. The next one is a Boolean variable. Boolean is true or false, so we look at the OFX Boolean parameter. If it's a single one, then we can just get the Boolean value. If there's multiple ones, then we have to go through the OFX Boolean keyframe parameter, and we can get the time, value, and interpolation again. Next one is a string. We have to look at the OFX string parameter. If there's more than one, we have to go through the OFX string keyframes, and that will let us look at the strings. Next we have custom, which is an OFX custom parameter, and likewise we have an OFX custom keyframe. And finally we've just stuck a default down here so that if it's none of the above, we're just going to say we don't know what this parameter is. And then once again we display it, each one as we come across it, and we'll see how this works. So now let's run the script, and we will see that we have the Gaussian blur with the horizontal range, and we have a keyframe count equals 2. The first keyframe is at 0 with a value of 0.0063. The second keyframe is at 7 seconds and 3 frames with a value of 0.57 and so forth. Next we have the vertical range. It has a single value of 0.063. Next we have the R parameter, which has 2 keyframes. At the value at time code 0, it is set to false. At time code 4 seconds and 8 frames, the value is set to 2. And then G, B, and A, all three have a keyframe of 0. All of them are set to true. And then looking at the next effect, we have spherize with a center. That's a 2D, and the two values are 0.5 and 0.5. Then we have an amount that has 2 keyframes. At the 0 keyframe, it is set to a value of 1. At 5 seconds and 21 frames, it is set to a value of -1. Then we get down to scaling horizontal. It also has 2 keyframes. The initial value at the 0 time code is 0.245, and the keyframe at 8 seconds and 4 frames has a value of 0.605. And then the scaling vertical has a single keyframe of a value of 0.245, and then the scaling proportional has a single keyframe set to true. Looking at the next effect, we will see we have vignette. The outer radius has a single keyframe. All of these just have a single keyframe, and these show the values that are set to those keyframes. So for example, down here on the RGBA, the color parameter, you notice the single keyframe value is 0, 0, 0, and 1. That's the R, G, B, and A. And so we can see there is quite a bit of code to go through each of the individual parameters. Fortunately, all the code is basically exactly the same on each one. It's mainly a matter of changing the parameter types to match the type of parameter it is. So if it's an RGB parameter, we have to use the OFX RGB parameter type and the OFX RGB keyframe type. And as long as those types match, they're all the same. So as long as you've got one down, you've got them all. So just make sure that your types match, and you'll be able to go through each one of these keyframes just fine. Please sign up at www.JETDV.com and subscribe on YouTube to get further notifications on when new videos are presented.